Implementing EIDL, Module 4, Translating Assessments to Action Plans. In this learning module, we will focus on translating our assessment findings and recommendations into action plans. In learning module number 3, we covered how to do the assessments themselves, assessing our processes, organization, technologies, and governance and reporting. And in this module, we will learn how to take the output of that assessment effort and translate that into recommendations and then into action plans. At the end of this module, we will also discuss setting up your EIDL implementation program and establishing an IT service management high-level architecture. Here's a recap of where we're at so far. Again, we have presented our EIDL implementation lifecycle that starts with the ITSM visioning, moves on to assessment, then planning, initial wins, design, and transition. And remember that once we get done with this lifecycle, we circle back around to the visioning stage, select more items to complete that will help improve our IT services, and then re-execute these steps again. In learning module number 1, we took a view of the entire overall approach. Learning module 2, we discussed the ITSM visioning stage. In learning module 3, we discussed the ITSM assessment stage. Now here in learning module 4, we'll finish that ITSM assessment stage by translating those assessment findings to initial wins, and then we'll get into the ITSM planning stage, and we'll also discuss the ITSM initial win stage as well. In this module, we will have 4 lessons. The first lesson will cover how we translate those assessment findings to initial wins. In lesson 2, we'll take a look at the initial wins work stage, a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the key activities and how you implement some of those initial wins. In lesson 3, we'll take a look at the ITSM planning work stage and also take a deeper dive there to discuss how we build our EIDL implementation program and set that up. And then finally in lesson 4, we'll start to touch on the IT service management architecture. Your implementation effort should establish an architecture at the start, and some of the concepts around what you put together to do that will be what we discuss in this particular lesson. Module 4, Lesson 1, Translating Assessment Findings to Initial Wins. In this lesson, we'll briefly review what we discussed in Module 3 around assessments and the general workflow as to how those assessments worked. Then we'll turn to discuss how we turn our assessment findings into action plans and initial wins. We'll show you how to do this using a fairly simple spreadsheet approach, and we'll take you step by step in terms of how we translate those assessment findings into those action plans and initial wins. So let's take a look and review what the initial flow was for doing assessments. Again, we start by conducting our assessments, and we discussed much of the steps and ideas involved with that in learning module number 3. We then develop findings and gaps. We then turn these into action items, combine them into initial wins, and then finally develop our initial win write-ups. And again, this is the flow for how we will translate those assessments to initial wins. In learning module 4, we will now focus on the latter 4 stages that are shown here. Develop findings and gaps, turning these into action items, combining them into initial wins, and then doing your write-ups. And we'll show how this kind of flows using a simple spreadsheet approach. Again, let's take a review in terms of the assessment work stage tasks and outputs. We've already done many of these steps so far. This shows the key activities and outputs for the work stage. And again, remember that the key goal of this work stage was to identify gaps, recommendations, and create a prioritized set of initial wins. In Learning Module 3, we covered focusing the assessment, assessing our processes, technologies, organization, and governance practices. Now in this module, we'll analyze those assessment findings, identify those into recommendation actions, and then translate those to the initial wins. Again, a review here of our key assessment outputs, producing assessment results, recommendations, and our inventory of prioritized action items, and then initial win projects. The assessment results outputs were really done earlier when we discussed assessing our processes, technologies, organization, and governance practices. Now we're going to turn to creating those assessment recommendation actions, creating that inventory of those actions to be taken to overcome the gaps that we identified during the assessment. We'll then inventory those prioritized action items, and then we'll create and group those into those initial win projects. And again, that is the general approach for how we will do this translation from assessment findings eventually into our initial win projects. Again, here's a review from Learning Module 3 on our assessment stage workflow. The assessment is conducted and produces findings or gaps between your current state for your IT organization and ITIL good practices. Again, we took these from observations. We did assessment ratings, maturity levels, looked at some outputs and deliverables that your department may typically produce, and came out with just a raw set of findings and gaps. We will now take each of these findings and gaps and translate them into those action items. In other words, for each gap found, what needs to be done to overcome the gap? Following this, we'll create action items that are prioritized and grouped into one or more initial win projects. So let's get started on our translation effort. We'll start by putting a simple spreadsheet together. The spreadsheet will be used to literally document all the gaps and findings in our assessment and show how we took each one of those and translated that to create an initial win project. Again, the benefits of this spreadsheet approach will be that you can sort by any one of these columns and always go back to how decisions were made in terms of the projects that were selected and how the prioritization was done. The first step on this spreadsheet is to inventory all the findings from the assessment activities. The findings themselves are listed in the gap column. Notice that each one of these is associated with a reference number, which is really in the first column called REF, R-E-F. The area column associates which ITIL process is best associated with the finding. So in the first example, you can see that the service desk and support staff experience confusion over which incidents are more critical than others. This will become part of whatever incident management process solution that we decide we might put into place. The category column then identifies a major pillar that is associated with the finding. Remember, our pillars are one of the four areas: process, technology, organization, and governance. And so for the first example, with the incident management example that we just mentioned, we feel that the staff experience and confusion, that the solution for that will probably happen through some kind of a process solution. So therefore we put process in that column associated with that row. Now let's go on to the next step. Here we've now added another column to the right-hand side called Action Items. What we're doing here is that we are synthesizing our findings into the action items, literally translating the gap, if you will, from saying what's actually taking place to saying what do we need to do in order to mitigate that particular gap. So let's go back and look at that first example. Here the service desk support staff was confused over which incidents are more critical than others. We figured that this will be part of an incident management solution, and we will probably fix that by developing something as part of an incident management process. So the category again says process. So for our action items that directly address that gap, we've analyzed that and concluded that we will develop an incident management policy which will identify the criticality of incidents that people can refer to. We will also need to identify an incident prioritization scheme and document that as well as part of the policy. So those two items are now action items that, if put into place, would now mitigate that gap of confusion over which incidents are more critical than others. Note that it's reasonable to identify more than one action item to address the finding, if that makes sense. So it's okay to have multiple action items to address each gap, as you kind of see in this example. Also note that you can reuse action items for multiple gaps. So an action item that you take to fix one gap may also be just as useful to fix maybe another gap that you see out there. Now let's take a look at how we prioritize these action items that we developed earlier. Notice that we're now adding several more columns to our spreadsheet. So for this step, we're going to use these columns to identify the cost, benefit, effort, and risk. That risk being, if we don't mitigate the gap, what might happen, and a barrier to implementing the action item. The way to do this that's fairly simple and a recommended approach is to rate each action item under each column, cost, benefit, effort, using a high, medium, or low rating. It is recommended when you run through this effort that this be done first by those doing the assessment, and then through some workshop settings or special meetings and interviews or focus sessions, reviewing what the assessor came up with and then modifying that, taking into account comments and opinions and observations by the rest of the assessment team and stakeholders. Again, a series of workshops can be done to make sure that everyone is in agreement with these ratings as you develop them. As you put these ratings out, high, medium, or low, or HML as you see in the example here, you will need to document criteria in terms of what does a low really mean, what does a high really mean, or medium really mean. So for example, if we look at cost, what would a low cost look like? What would a medium cost or a high cost look like? We'll show you some examples of how to do this coming up in a few more slides. Once you identify this, develop a rating score based on the HML that's put into the column. This score can be derived using the suggested weighting table shown on the slide. The result of this is that those action items that will provide the greatest benefit at minimal cost and effort will get the highest scores. Take a look at that weighting table, and let's take a look at cost just for example. So how the way this works is that under the cost, if we put an L in there, then if I'm in the cost category, I'm going to count that as 9 points. If it's in the benefit, and L is in the benefit category, it counts as 1 point. If it's in the effort category, it counts as 9 again. And if it's in the barrier, it counts as 9 also. So we will use these to help figure out the scores and then add them across to get that final score tally, which you see in the score column, for each action item that's shown there. So let's take a look at one of these just as an example to walk through it. Let's take a look at the last one. It says the action item is establish ongoing training for service desk staff to increase their skill levels. We've rated the cost to L. In other words, we feel that's not very much in terms of high cost to train the service desk staff. So it gets 9 points because we want to boost that score up, because low cost is always a good thing to have when we're moving forward with an action item. Let's take a look at the benefit. The benefit is H, or high. So we see there's a lot of benefit there if we do train the service desk staff. Again, if I have an H in that benefit column, it's worth a 9. So again, that helps really boost the score up. Effort is low, risk is low, and the barrier to implement is low as well. So again, that will also yield some high scores. So if we add these together, we see that we have a score of 37 across the board, which is actually higher than some of the other examples that are shown before that. Again, this is just an example of how you can start to pull these together. And as you can see, when you start to sort by the score column, you can now bring the most important action items to the top of your spreadsheet and easily see which ones people will be more interested in pursuing. Prioritizing action items in a workshop. here's a set of steps you can try in a workshop setting to help people run through this. These steps provide an organized and facilitated approach for identifying and agreeing which action items will get the highest priority. What we're going to do in a workshop setting is we're going to place the action items, the cost, the benefit, effort, and barrier columns kind of on a very large board that everybody can see the front of the room. We're now going to discuss each action item one by one, first to make sure that everybody understands what the action item is saying. We'll then discuss whether we might need to add additional action items to the list. So initially the assessor has come up with the action items, but maybe after talking to your stakeholders, it may be determined that other ones might be needed. We'll then agree criteria for high, medium, low. And again, here's some brief examples. We'll see more of these coming up in a bit. We're basically saying, just taking cost, for example, if it's greater than, say, $500,000 US, we're going to consider that high. Effort, if it's less than 3 months, we might consider that as low, so we'll get an L. So you can see we're putting just some very base criteria that's easy to understand for ranking those HM and Ls under each of those categories. We'll now give the participants in the room 3 stacks of 20 colored dots. Each stack is a different color that represents high, medium, and low. Each participant can then spend the dots as they choose for each column. So the participants will then walk up to the board and they will put, let's say you used a red dot for high, they'll put the red dots under cost or under benefit or under effort where they see fit. Once that's done, somebody in the room facilitating the meeting will then add up all the dots and obtain an average high, medium, and low rating for each item. So they're going to look at each cell there and then decide based on all the dots put into it whether that's going to end up being a high, medium, or low, and then help score those across the board. So again, this is one way that you can run a workshop and then help to get these ratings for each of these action items and get a little bit of agreement in the room in terms of what the priority and the eventual score for each action item could be. Here's some examples of setting criteria for those high, mediums, and lows. Again, there's no rule or science around how you do this, but we just presented some examples here that might give you some ideas in terms of how you might do this. Under effort, you can see that we've said here's high, medium, low, and the criteria might be under effort high if we know that resources will be needed for 6 to 9 months or probably even longer. We might give it a medium if we think we can complete the action item in maybe a 3 to 5 month time period. And we might give it a low if we can complete the action item in 2 months or less. Again, these are subjective, but they kind of put stakes in the ground in terms of where those HMLs might fall. And it helps people understand why they're putting an HM or L up on the board for each action item versus them just making a relative guess. Here's another one looking at barrier. If we have to have new skills, major training efforts, or we need to bring in third-party consultants, or maybe this effort or completion of this action item might impact more than 3 departments, we might give that a high. If we know we can do this with just a little bit of training and maybe less than 3 departments are involved, we might give it a medium. And if we know that we don't need to do any training and maybe only 1 department's impact, we might give that a low. So in other words, the barrier to get something done would be much easier if 1 department's impacted and there really isn't any new kinds of skills or training needed. And then cost, again, just some more examples under cost might be high if I know I need to use new tools and I know I'm going to have a major tool implementation involved with the action item. Might be a medium if I can customize existing tools, and a low maybe if I know I can already leverage existing tools that I have in place. Again, you can do cost by dollars. You can do that by estimated effort. Here we use the tooling example. It's really up to you in terms of how you want to describe these. But again, here's just some examples of how you might establish these. Do this in advance of your workshop, and again, you might review these with the workshop participants so that there's agreement as to what a high, medium, or low really means in each category. Now let's go back to our spreadsheet. Here we're going to start grouping our action items into initial win projects. So we've added 2 more columns to the spreadsheet. The initial win project column identifies the title of a suggested initial win project. This is now going to become associated with one or more action items to be addressed by that project. The XREF column is really just a reference to the initial win project. So think of it kind of like a project ID, and it's just listed there so it's easy to reference back to the initial win project that's there. You can kind of see how this is being done. If we look at the first two action items, develop an incident management policy, we've said that we need to implement an incident management policy as an initial action item. And we've given this ID of P1, or Project 1. We also say identify an incident prioritization scheme. That's the second action item. And here we're linking that action item back to that implement an incident management policy. So the initial win project, implement an incident management policy, will be used to develop an incident management policy and also develop the prioritization scheme. And we use the P1 there as an XREF that just makes it simpler to quickly understand that we're reusing a initial win project that we've already defined later on down the spreadsheet. Again, developing this can be done first by the assessors and then in a series of workshops to get consensus with your stakeholders. Remember again that by using this spreadsheet approach, we can easily sort by any column and reference back to the assessment finding that resulted in the recommendations used in the initial wins that we derived. Just an example of how this works efficiently is if I sorted by that XREF column, I would see all the P1s together and then all the action items grouped with those P1s, and then those action items would become really almost like a scope statement in terms of what would be underneath the covers for implementing an incident management policy, just in that example. So here's some examples of initial win projects. The Implementing ITIL book gives you a much longer inventory of examples of these projects, but here's just some just to kind of give you a flavor for what's involved with initial wins. Notice how specific these projects are. Building a service catalog, holding a contest for the best IT cost savings idea, establishing a problem analysis toolkit, implementing a standardized incident classification categories. Other ones in here, last one, ensuring all changes are at least logged, implementing SLAs and OLAs with key business units, and we've kind of shown you which processes kind of use each one of these. Notice that these are very, very specific. It's easy to look at these and see the outcomes that will occur. An example of a bad project, in terms of an initial win, would be one where you might have a very vague title on it, like Implement Change Management Best Practices. Okay, what does that really mean? What do you get out of that? So while it sounds nice, it doesn't really identify with a work artifact that people could kind of grab onto and see and touch. So again, you want your initial win projects to be very specific in terms of what they're delivering, and hopefully this will be fairly straightforward when you link these back to your action items. As a last step, we're going to add one more column to our spreadsheet. This is the priority column. And what we're doing here is simply prioritizing the initial win projects. This is really done by just simply adding up the scores for each action item to be included with that initial win project. Total those scores, and now you have a priority score for your initial win projects. Again, this should be done in a workshop setting with key stakeholders. When you sort now by the priority column, you will see which initial win projects now come to the top, which ones are the highest in terms of priority. And you want to review those with your stakeholders to see, kind of stepping back, taking kind of a sanity check, are those truly the initial win projects that everybody wants to go forward with? So you'll be taking a final pass and then confirming acceptance of which projects will be the most critical to implement as you go forward. Now that we have our initial win projects, we're now going to create write-ups to provide more detail around what's really involved with the initial win projects that are there. There are two things that need to occur here. First, all stakeholders should agree on how many initial win projects are to be implemented. It's quite possible that you may have many more projects than what people feel comfortable including within the scope of your initial implementation effort for this life cycle. Those projects or initial win projects not included could be deferred to a later improvement cycle, if that makes sense. Secondly, each initial win is now documented in a brief manner that highlights its key activities, acceptance criteria, and other information deemed important for justifying a project by your company. What goes into the write-up may be dictated by how your company creates charters for projects and programs. Here's some suggested categories that are shown on this slide. One of the things to note that under key activities is that you can use all the action items that are linked to this initial win to quickly fill in what are all the types of things that you're going to accomplish and do as a part of this initial win project. At the end of this effort, you now have a list of what initial win projects will be part of your implementation effort. You've got high-level descriptions to initiate those projects, and you're now really ready to start taking a look at the next phase, which is the ITSM planning step as we go forward. Here is yet just one more example of an initial win write-up. We've included it here because this version includes a high-level estimate of the effort needed to execute the initial win projects. For that effort, if you need to pull something like this together, consider going back to those high, medium, lows that you put when we did our scoring effort. You can use that under effort, possibly under effort and or cost, and use that to create some assumptions in terms of the number of days or months or general effort that this particular project might take. So again, you can go back to that spreadsheet as a reference to help pull information together to describe some of your write-ups. Here's an example of how the program office might track implementation activities. A broad chart's maintained that shows each activity undertaken, key milestones, and planned implementation timeframes. On this chart, you most likely will list all your initial win projects that you're going to undertake, possibly maybe get into the actual action items to show what's actually being done, but at a minimum, listing what those projects are. As an option, notice that you can put bars across columns that kind of show a timeline when each initial win will be executed. Each bar, if you want, can be color-coded based on how well each effort is doing as you start undertaking and moving into the implementation effort of implementing that win. As an example, you might use a red color to indicate the effort's behind, maybe a green if it's on target, maybe a yellow if there's some issues or warnings. And in that way, you almost have a report that could act a little bit like an ITIL implementation dashboard for management. So here's really an example where we're now taking that list of initial wins, starting to put that into a roadmap format, show how that looks over time, and then kind of use that maybe to maintain kind of like a little bit of a management dashboard for our effort as we move forward. Module 4, Lesson 2, the Initial Wins Work Stage, a Deeper Dive. In this lesson, we'll be taking a high-level look at that Initial Wins Work Stage. Note that the Initial Wins Work Stage is tied tightly to the initial win projects that you identified earlier. So the Initial Win stage really takes an overall project approach for each initial win that you plan to be undertaking. This stage overlaps with the ITSM design work stage and the ITSM transition work stages. The reason being is that there is design work you will need to do that impacts your initial win project, and there's also transition work that you will be doing that also impacts your initial win project as that moves towards production. Here's our Initial Wins work stage overview in terms of tasks and outputs. Our key goal here is to implement tactical IT service management solutions that people can see benefit, see and touch in terms of what the output is actually coming up with. So in this stage, we'll manage our initial win projects, managing each initial win project just like a regular project. We'll perform some initial win planning, design or procuring a solution, building and configuring that solution, conducting fit-for-purpose testing, perform initial win acceptance activities, conducting solution rollout planning, communications, preparation, and training, and then finally distributing and installing the solution. Now, some of you that are familiar with ITIL version 2 may notice a very strong similarity between these steps for initial wins and what the ITIL release management lifecycle looks like in ITIL version 2. And that was actually done on purpose. We will be using similar approaches to implement our initial wins. For those of you that are ITIL version 3 zealots and feel that we should be tied closer to ITIL version 3, those steps are really still there. However, you might group some of these together. Service strategy for ITIL version 3 would cover all the assessment, not necessarily the assessment, but it would cover all the planning and the identification of the initial win and the estimating of project resources that we're using to put that in place. Then things like design and procure solution would fit under service design. Build and configure solution, conducting fit-for-purpose testing, performing initial win acceptance activities, rollout planning, communication preparation and training, and distribute and install solutions will all really fall under the ITIL v3 service transition. So again, you can group these into ITIL v3 or v2. I prefer v2 only because it identifies these activities in a little more lower level detail. However, it's really up to you in terms of how you want to view this. It's not really all that much critical as long as you're doing these steps. One last thing here is to remember that in each initial win project that you run, always again think of those 4 pillars of the solution. You will be designing and transitioning process, technologies, organization, and governance and reporting. So those will all become part of the scope of your initial win effort as you move forward. The initial wins effort starts with those project plans from the assessment and planning work stages and executes those projects from design through implementation, again guided by that ITIL release management process. So one way to look at this, we're almost using ITIL release management to kind of bootstrap our efforts even as we just get started to moving forward. Notice that the core team, extended team, and advisor team, remember we covered those concepts very briefly in learning module number 3. The core team, if you remember, will be responsible for the actual hands-on work of implementing that initial win effort. The extended team will kind of act like a group of stakeholders that will provide input to that core team and also shop that solution around with the business units or IT units that they represent to make sure there's acceptance. And then the advisor teams may be sponsoring and overseeing the entire effort, or maybe helping to identify staffing resources or other funding that might be needed to execute that initial win effort. We'll look at these again, core team, extended team, advisor team, in more detail in an upcoming module. But again, want to keep that concept in front of you so you start to become a little bit familiar with that. We develop those project plans, and at the end we have our completed initial win projects. And that could include an installed tool, an established CAB or organization, maybe a process that's been installed, maybe a plan, or some other forms or documents that are now in place. Again, those are just examples. But remember that each initial win produces something very tangible that can be seen and touched and provides value and benefit to your organization. So as we implement each initial win project, again, we will be using the ITIL release management lifecycle that, if you want, is located in ITIL version 2. And I've reproduced the diagram here on this particular slide out of the book, just so you can kind of reacquaint yourself with that if you haven't seen that before. Remember that you're going to follow this life cycle for each initial win project. So if you have 3 initial win projects that you plan to implement, each one of those will follow this life cycle. They'll typically go from design to build to test to deployment. Again, a side benefit, this allows you a little bit to test and bootstrap the release management process. It may not be what you set out to do, but at least you're getting a leg up there as you start to build your IT service management solutions. In addition, if you have multiple initial win efforts that are going on all at the same time, you may want to consider not deploying these individually, but maybe packaging these together in a release-like fashion to minimize disruption to the business and the organizations as these solutions are being put into place. Again, you're bootstrapping and stealing a little bit from that idle release management process to help make this work. Initial wins can be categorized by the idle processes they support. And in a way, we've already done that. If we go back to our assessment spreadsheet where we translated those gaps and findings to initial wins, you'll see that each action item that was identified had a process area associated with it. On this particular slide, we just presented some more examples of the kinds of initial wins you might come out with based on each of the different idle processes. The Implementing Idle book certainly has a lot more examples than what we're showing here. We just couldn't fit everything onto a slide. But take a quick moment just to take a look at this and just kind of get familiar with the kinds of things that may be fairly typical depending on the processes that you're trying to implement. This identifies some key outputs from your initial wins work stage. These identify typical outputs that should occur with each initial win project. Other outputs might include artifacts produced by each initial win effort, such as a release policy or a service catalog. Again, those other artifacts will be highly dependent based on the intent of why each initial win was created and put into place. But taking a look at these are fairly typical of each initial win project that you'll have. We have an integrated initial work plan in terms of how we're going to execute this. Solution designs, which will be output from the design efforts. Test criteria for how we're going to test this, test plans. Maybe a sign-off from your stakeholders or users that will be using this. A rollout strategy for how this will be moved and transitioned into production. And a communications plan in terms of how we will communicate this solution, especially if it involves training or other types of changes or new skills that people need to have in order to work with it. So again, these are just examples. The Implementing Idle book does give you more examples of these and some details behind some of these. But the purpose here is to start to give you a feel for what would be involved with each initial win project as it goes forward. Note that if you're putting together your work plans, your detailed work plans for each initial win project, you can kind of use the idle release management lifecycle that we saw in earlier slides, combined with these kinds of outputs to give you a real jump start in terms of putting that plan together. If you have a service portfolio already in place, then you can link these initial wins to the services that they impact. Now, if you're just getting started, you may be wondering what's a service portfolio, or we haven't really built one yet, so why would this make sense? But hopefully one of the action items that comes out of your assessment effort is that you need to put a basic service portfolio in place. It is very important for IT, especially when working with IDLE version 3, to have documented, at least at a high level, what all the services are that they are delivering to their end users and customers. If you're not doing this, then one may start to wonder, how does anybody know what IT is supposed to be doing? So early on, you might put together a very basic portfolio, and all we're recommending here is that as you develop your initial wins, tie them back to the services that are impacted by that and include those in the portfolio as another information item. Here's an example for how your IT service management program might be organized. Again, the example we used here was for a large global company. A small company you may collapse a lot of these into one or two people to execute on. A large company, you may need a much more sophisticated project approach to do this. Since there are three major work stages occurring simultaneously, again, those work stages are your initial wins, looking at each thing by project, your IT service management design, doing the design efforts, your IT service management transition, doing the development and eventual rollout efforts. The same organization approach should and can be used really across the board for all of those. So here at the top in this example, we have a global IT service management program office. Reporting into that office is an IT service management program manager. Since this is a global organization, we have global process owners, and then reporting into them are the initial win project leads or heads. Off to the side, you can see we have local process owners. So this would be if I'm a very large international company, I may decide to have local ownership of processes, maybe by different regions or large centers. And I also have my subject matter experts. And then remember, we have our four pillars represented here. We've got the process part being represented by our process owners. Organization, you see the track leader there. Technology on the right-hand side, there's a track leader for that effort. And then we have our extended core advisor teams that are there, and then something called the coalition team that's also part of the organization. And then these all work with the business units and other IT organizations that may be impacted by the initial wins that are going into place. Again, we'll take a look at the extended core and advisor teams in more detail a little later on in another learning module. And we'll also talk about coalition teams and what that really means. But just to give you a preview of that, coalition teams are really an effective way of working if you have lots and lots of IT centers or locations where everybody needs to start getting on board with the same process and the same solutions that you're building. And we're going to use a concept called the coalition team to help make that happen in a very efficient manner. We'll talk much more about how that happens in a later learning module. Module 4, Lesson 3, the ITSM Planning Work Stage, a deeper dive. In this lesson, we'll take a brief look at the planning work stage. You will quickly see that there really is nothing that is much unique in this work stage. It simply establishes the program office, initiates the program, and helps put together the plans for those initial win efforts as you move forward with your implementation. Common management practices, such as those in PRINCE2 or the Project Management Institute, PMI, can easily serve as the approach you can use for this work stage. What we will do in this lesson is just add on a few additional concepts that are ITIL and IT service management related to this effort as you move forward. Here's our planning work stage overview. Again, the goal of this work stage is to identify the detailed plans and program infrastructure. This represents the key tasks and outputs for planning activities. In this work stage, your IT Service Management Program Office is formalized, program responsibilities are identified and assigned, and work plans are detailed and finalized for moving forward with your initial win efforts and also your design work stage. Actually, both of those stages will happen in tandem as you get started. So here we're going to establish that program office, in other words, putting the resources in place to run. Now, the reason we're doing this as a program, remember, is that this is not just one project, but is a series of many projects. Plus, remember that this is also ongoing. So if we are having a number of initial win efforts that are going on at the same time, we want to make sure we coordinate those efforts through a generalized program office structure. We're establishing program working standards, and by working standards, this is really just setting standards for how the project teams will each work and operate. So for example, if they need to produce a work plan, what's the structure of that work plan and what tool might they use to produce that work plan with? How do they report project progress, for example? If there are any tools that are to be used in design, or maybe even just simply things like Microsoft Office tools as a standard for producing documents, setting up maybe a SharePoint or document repository site for all artifacts as the project is proceeding through its paces. Those are examples of program working standards that you need to identify at the front and put into place. We need to prepare program work plans. So these are plans that identify the tasks, steps, milestones, and work products that come out of your efforts. We need to prepare the project teams, assemble the teams together, make sure the resources are available. If there's any pre-training that needs to happen, for example, you may find that you want to certify your project team members in ITIL Foundation as a starting point. That kind of an effort would start as well. Preparing program communications. Remember that we said that this is really a program of organizational change more than an IT project. So to that end, we need to start putting our strategies in place for how we're going to communicate with our different stakeholders, what communication events may take place that are needed, such as training, or maybe we use more softer means such as maybe brown bags, lunch and learns, maybe it's a newsletter at the company, but preparing those program communications and a strategy for how we're going to pull all that together. Again, that's not a small task, but doing that would happen here in the planning stage. And then lastly, just before we're ready to go, make sure that we get a formal go-ahead decision from our stakeholders to proceed with the initial win effort and that ITSM design effort as well. Here's some examples of responsibilities that will be within that IT Service Management Program Office. The office is critical towards integrating IT service management implementation efforts, coordinating implementation activities, and communicating implementation progress to the program sponsors and senior executives. So some examples of these activities include providing generalized project management services for each of the initial win projects. Perhaps your project managers for each one of those will report, or maybe they're already part of your program office. Ensuring that your initial win solutions are provided using the process guidelines and policies that start to become developed as you get through that ITSM design stage and implementation life cycle. Ensuring there's no conflicts between initial win projects. Ensuring that projects and cross-project dependencies are managed and addressed. So it's possible you may have one initial win effort that's dependent on the input or output of another initial win effort, and you need to coordinate that. Typically through your program office would help facilitate that and make that happen. Being insured and protecting your stakeholders to make sure they don't get asked to perform tasks in a chaotic fashion. If I have lots of initial win efforts and each project team member for those efforts is constantly going out to the stakeholders only within the guidelines of their own project, it's possible that the stakeholders may get swamped with lots of requests to do things or look at review items. Therefore, the program office can help coordinate that and reduce some of that workload for them. Making sure that ensuring synergies between your initial win activities are leveraged. So if there's a common meeting that can serve several purposes, then using that as an approach. Maintaining a consolidated schedule of initial win activities. So they've got the master schedule, if you will, of all the activities across all the projects that are going on. And then also ensuring that issues between initial win teams are addressed and resolved. One last concept here is the work breakdown structure which we use in the Implementing ITIL book. This illustrates a typical approach for organizing each work stage in the implementation effort. So a simple breakdown from the work stage down to the low-level activities can be developed in a manner as shown on this slide. Note that almost every key effort should be using people, process, technology, and governance in their view of the solutions being developed. So here we start at the top and we have our ITIL implementation work stage, and as an example you see we have an IT service management design, so that work stage is being represented. Within that there are those 5 tracks of effort. We call those work tracks. So there's a focus on people and organization, a focus on process things that need to get done, a focus on technology, a focus on governance, and then management is really the project management for the efforts that are going on. So again, in the ITSM design stage, I need to design my organization, design my processes, design my tools and technology, and design my governance, decision-making, and reporting that I'm going to be using. And then I need to manage that effort as we go forward. So that's why those work tracks are there. Within each work track, I'll have work tasks, work steps, and work products. And that's just a simple hierarchy. So I have a work task, and in this example, we took design incident management process. Again, your work task may be linked at the highest level back to your initial win projects and your action items that you said are associated with each initial win project that you're working with. And then I can explode, if you will, the detail work steps out for each one of these work tasks. And again, there's no law or science around this other than how much detail you feel you need to provide to help guide people in terms of the steps that need to be taken. So each work task will consist of work steps, and then work steps may produce work products as part of their efforts. So in the example shown here, the work task design incident management process includes a work step called create an incident management process guide, and the output of that step is a actual process guide that's shown there. Again, just a very simple way, but a good structured way of looking at how you might organize all your work tasks and put plans together as you move forward in your implementation. Module 4, Lesson 4, Establishing the IT Service Management Architecture. We are going to use the concept of an IT service management architecture to act as the defining blueprint that will be referenced by all those that are building and working and implementing your ITIL solutions. Let's think about why we might want an architecture. In the United States, I believe it's in San Diego, California, there's a house out there called the Winchester House. And one of the interesting things about that house is there was no real architecture there. What the owner did is they built the house literally one room at a time, adding staircases here, adding additional rooms over there. And this went on for a period of about maybe 20 years or so. What they ended up with was an interesting large house with lots of rooms where the rooms don't quite fit together. Staircases go up to nowhere. Walls suddenly appear where they don't need to be. In short, the house is very dysfunctional in nature. Perhaps this looks a bit like your IT organization. Think historically what's probably been going on. Your organization's probably been purchasing tools one by one to solve specific problems, and all of a sudden over time you may find yourself in a situation where there are lots of tools, overlapping functionalities in terms of what those tools provide, and maybe even some conflicts and complexity created by all the tools that you may be using. Here's another example for an architecture. Think about this with a building. Let's say you're in an office building and it's decided to add an additional room, if you will, to that office. What is the first thing that all the people involved with building that room do? The people that do the construction, the heating, the electrical. They go pull out the architecture plans, and there's a common blueprint for how the building's put together, and they use that as reference so that as they put their individual pieces and parts of what they're building into that building, it all ties back to that central plan in terms of how that building holds together. This is exactly the concept that we want to do with our ITIL and IT service management solution. So in this lesson, we'll talk a little bit about architecture and also about tooling and address how that kind of fits into the situation of what you're implementing. So again, as a quick review, why is having an IT service management architecture so important? Number one, without one, you're flying blind, buying one tool after another with no overall plan. We kind of mentioned the results and outcomes of doing something like that. More importantly, we may miss needed tools. We may suddenly discover we've got critical functions that we need to have in place, and there's really no tooling support behind them. We may find that we're buying tools that end up providing little value, or perhaps we have lots of tools that are sitting on the shelf, literally unused. We may have another situation where we have lots of tools and they're all kind of doing the same thing. The tools themselves may not integrate well, or maybe they just flat out get in the way of all your efforts in terms of supporting your IT services. So having an architecture, again, the main goal here is to provide that defining blueprint for how all the pieces and parts will fit together, and kind of use that as a way to help guide everyone's activities as they go forward. When looking at tools, tools provide basically several key functions. They automate manual tasks that are commonly performed. They enforce the processes that you're designing and any standards associated with them. They also, as a side benefit, ensure that information used with those tools is entered and processed in a very accurate manner. So tools most certainly have a very important place in your solution. They can't be forgotten about, and they really need to be there to support your processes efficiently. Don't make the mistake of using the tool, however, to drive your process solution. You still need to have the solution that works best within your company, understand how that operates, and that all the tool is really providing for you is an enforcement of that solution and some automation, so that you might not be doing everything in a manual effort, which may take a lot of time and effort on everyone's part. So again, use the tools as a way of automating what you're doing and enhancing what you're doing, but they shouldn't be driving the approach or how you intend to operate. In your IT service management architecture, what really goes inside this? The details behind this are included with the Architecting ITIL book, which is part of your student materials. However, at a broad brush, let's take a look at the kinds of things that go into the architecture. Note here I've got a functional architecture, data architecture, process architecture, organization architecture, and a service architecture. These represent different slices, if you will, of the architecture that are viewed in terms of how things are put together. Notice that we have our four pillars covered here very well. We have process, we have technology, which is going to be represented through data and function, our organization, and our service architecture. Let's take a look at each of these a little bit more deeper. Let's start with the IT service management functional architecture. The functional architecture will describe the types of tools needed to support IT service management. So when we say types of tools, the examples below kind of indicate what we're talking about. Notice how generic these are. We know that in order to operate, we need things like a capacity modeling system, a job scheduling system, a call management system if we're running a service desk. We need an intrusion detection system for security, maybe a report generator, maybe an incident management system, a change management system. So again, we've identified the types of tools that we need to support what we're doing. Notice that we've stayed away from specific vendors, vendor products, and tool names in doing this. We're focusing on the function, simply referring to it as a system that we need to have supported. Within each system, we're going to identify the features that are needed by each type of tool. Therefore, if we have something, let's say a job scheduling system that we've identified, what are some of the features with that job scheduling system? Might include backing up those job schedules, might include the ability to monitor the job schedules, might include the ability to create ad hoc schedules to indicate schedule progress. Maybe there's scripting that's involved with that for more complex scheduling needs. So those kinds of things, again, at a very high and a very generic level, we'd identify what goes in there. Once we have these, we can now map your current tool sets into each tool type and identify missing tool gaps or redundant use of the tools. Notice that this was the approach that we took when we discussed how to do the assessments and looked at the technology assessment. Again, putting an architecture together can really put the landscape out there, if you will, for how everything should fit and tie together. And you should be able to use your architecture so as you pop tools into that, you can see exactly where each tool is sitting and what it's covering. Now let's take a look at our IT service management data architecture. Here we're just simply describing the types of databases used to support IT service management. And guess where we can steal these from probably all the ITIL books because they're always referenced. Incident management database, problem management database, release management database. You kind of get the idea where we're coming from with this. But let's get what all these databases are into our architecture so we have a general view in terms of the types of databases and repositories that we need to have in place in order to support our IT service management solutions. Within this architecture, we may also describe the data elements that exist within each database. So, for example, maybe things like release packages, service design packages, service solution prototypes and demos, site implementation plans, site surveys, software distribution managers. That all might become data elements that are part of maybe our release management database. So by doing this, we've actually taken a bit of a jump start on implementing some form of ITIL configuration management, because each data item that we identify for these repositories, we might actually start to look at this and say that this really starts to begin looking like a configuration item type or CI type. It's an interesting way of just trying to look at what we're pulling together. In the Architecting ITIL book, you have a complete reference, and by the way, you also have a spreadsheet that gives you an electronic version of this, of all the data elements tied to the tool types, tied to the processes they support. And it's a very extensive list. I believe there's about 589 items in that list that are all the things that a typical large data center typically will need to have in place in order to operate, run, and build services for their clients and customers. Here's our IT service management organization architecture. This architecture identifies the roles needed to operate your ITIL solutions, identifies the activities assigned to each role, and again, here you see the concept of RACI, R-A-C-I, which we talked about in Learning Module 3. We identify the skill sets and skill levels needed for each role, and we map these roles into your IT organization structure. Please note that a role is not equal to a job function. So a job function is probably looking at your own organization chart, how your company efficiently recognizes the workers and then the management people that work within your organization. So for example, your company may use terms like maybe computer analyst 3 or manager level 1 or IT executive or other very generic job function names that they have. Roles represent a collection of activities, and it's important to identify what these roles are and what those activities are, because we can map these and tie these back into those job functions that are unique for your company. So for example, a role of, say, a capacity architect or a problem manager or a configuration librarian, once we have a definition of what those are and what the responsibilities of those roles are, then we simply just map that back to your organization. So for example, you may in your organization have somebody called Computer Analyst 3, and it's been determined that a Computer Analyst 3 is going to take on the roles of, let's say, configuration librarian and capacity architect, just for examples. Here's our IT service management process architecture. The process architecture is really around, and you'll hear this term meta architecture sometimes, or meta process, but this really identifies all the pieces and parts needed to have an effective process. I would almost view this as a checklist, if you will, to make sure that as you implement your processes, every one of these items shown in this diagram have been implemented. This provides the framework for describing and documenting the processes, and it's essentially the ITIL process model taken right out of the ITIL books. But the conjecture here is that if you are missing any one of these boxes, then you really don't have a process that's working or in place. If we took an example here, let's say we have a change management process, but we have no assigned owner under process control. That means there's nobody accountable for the change management process. Not a good situation there. If we didn't have a policy for change management, it would be very confusing around what's the rule set or the guidelines in terms of how we should be operating our change management solutions. Let's look at the bottom of this, process enablement. If I didn't have any resources assigned to change management, then essentially I've documented a process but nobody's using it, so it's just kind of shit sitting up on the bookshelf. Maybe if I didn't put the capabilities and the training and the skills in place, well, then I may have people assigned to work on change management activities, but they really don't know what they're doing or don't have the skills to make that work effectively. Likewise, under process execution, if I don't have inputs and outputs and roles and responsibilities and work instructions, then nobody really knows how to execute the change management process. So again, you can see that having each one of these, they all need to be in place in order to make sure your process is truly working and operating and functioning effectively. IT service management, service architecture. Again, as I said earlier, it's very important to make sure that your IT organization has a good handle on what are the services that they're delivering to the business and to their customers, even if it's just a list at this point in time. So your service architecture is going to be the place where you identify what those services and service lines are that you're supporting. Again, the Servicing ITIL book, which is part of your materials, has a very good set of descriptions and services that are very common for the IT core supporting services in just about any company that's out there. But the idea of this architecture is to get those services down on paper, provide the framework for how those services are described and documented, and over time you may decide to use this as input if you're developing a service portfolio or service catalog. Our IT Service Management Architecture Analysis tool was introduced to you when we went through Learning Module 3 and looked at the Tooling Technology Assessment. Again, just as a reminder, this is a tool you can use to analyze the tools that you have in place today, and also use as a reference for other tools that you may be starting to procure, creating tooling requirements and looking at what pieces and parts of your architecture you're trying to now make sure you have covered by the tools that are in place. Again, remember, this is a simple tool that you can use to plug in your current tool sets and platforms, your tool value ratings, generate some of those heat maps, and identify tools with little or no value, gaps, and redundancies. If you start to go through a procurement effort where now you're starting to look at tooling requirements and you're going to go out purchasing tools, again, as each vendor walks in the door and presents the tools that they have to offer, you can map their solutions back into this architecture and get a very common view in terms of how what they're proposing impacts your landscape. This makes looking at different tooling solutions from many different vendors much easier to do. So if a particular vendor says we have this new tooling suite, and by the way, it's part of this new architecture that we're presenting to our customers, you can take all the functions and functional areas that they're covering with their tool sets, map it back into your tooling architecture here, and get a very consistent view of how that vendor is going to be supporting or what they can support in terms of your solutions that you're putting forward. Lastly, governing the IT service management architecture. There are 4 key activities that need to happen that are in the circles here: architecture governance, exceptions and appeals, vitality, and communications. You need to have a process for governing your IT service management architecture literally from day one. And the reason for that is because as you go through your implementation effort, over time people will be consistently asking for changes, increases in scope, why don't you do a process this way versus that way. This will all start to happen literally from day one. Rather than simply tell those people to go away that you're too busy trying to implement, it's good to have a process in place where as people bring these things up, they can formally present what they're proposing as a change, and you now have a place to catch it and process it and determine whether it should truly be acted on or not. Another side benefit to this is that as people do this, they know that there's really a place for them to put suggestions and changes into this as you move forward. And this approach will guarantee that their suggestions are being taken seriously. This has a very big impact on their acceptance of your final solution, because whether you decide to take on their suggestion or not, they know that a team of people have reviewed the different things that are there and that a process was executed to determine whether their suggestion should be used or not used. Looking at some of these just at a very high level, and again, the Implementing ITIL book presents much more detail around these, as well as the Architecting ITIL book. But architecture governance is really around just maintaining your architecture as you get that documented, making sure that it's up to date, that it's made relevant. Your exceptions and appeals step in there will be the step that actually grabs requests as they start to come in, and looking at those and escalating decisions when they need to happen to make sure that changes that are being proposed to your solutions are being processed in an efficient manner. Architecture vitality kind of looks the other way. That's looking out at the industry and at research and looking at the latest things that are happening and deciding whether anything is relevant to the solutions you're putting in place. So by vitality, what we're really talking about there is keeping your architecture current with what's going on in the industry. And then architecture communications is all about communicating those changes and syndicating them across your project teams and across the various users and customers that you have that use the solutions that you're putting into place. So it's really a communication function more than anything else. So again, these things are described in more detail in the various materials that come with the course, but wanted to at least give you a feel here in terms of why these are in place and why having some form of architecture for this is, and a process for doing this is so important. Let's step back now and look at what we've covered so far and where we are going next. In Learning Module 1, we took an overview of the ITIL implementation approach, which is shown on this slide. In Learning Module number 2, we covered the ITSM visioning stage, setting our goals, objectives, and business reasons for why we're doing the ITIL implementation effort. In Learning Module 3, we went through the IT Service Management Assessment work stage. And again, in that stage, in Learning Module 3, we went through how to do assessments for our processes, technology, organization, and governance. In Learning Module 4, we finished off the assessment work stage by talking about how we translate the outputs of our assessment into action items and eventually into initial wins. We also discussed about setting up your ITIL project and also initial wins, how those operate, and also for establishing an IT service management architecture. So as we move to Learning Module 5, we'll now start to cover some key work steps in the IT service management design stage. One of the key things that we'll learn in that working module is how to build a process in 10 stages, step by step.